This one's a little strange. Watchtower asked a couple of times to remove a juror, but why would they want a mistrial or a juror cast out? Because the witnesses that Watchtower is objecting to are Watchtower followers themselves. And they're not being honest.
But we're going to kick them out after this trial anyway, so they're already disfellowshipped.
So the court's response is classic.
To what?
To what the Hudgens are doing. Their answer is just classic. It says, because a witness comes in and says, I don't remember, would be unable to proceed and complete a trial of any case. That would be giving a witness or witnesses the power to stop all proceedings in court. Trying to throw it out based on technicalities, but they're very odd technicalities. It's very bizarre. If that's how you can get a case thrown out, you could throw out any case.
Yeah, I want this case thrown out because I don't want to go to jail.
Hudgens himself actually did go to prison for a short time because of lying to the court. So here's a couple articles here.
Now here's another classic example.
Yeah.
Okay, why was that left out of the Revelation book when they talked about the 130, which we only found 2?
Yeah.
Why didn't they say, and one of the witnesses to this went to jail for lying in court?
It says the witness was committed to contempt and remained in prison until April 14th, 1919, when he was discharged by the United States Supreme Court upon a writ of habeas corpus on the ground that his testimony, even if false, did not obstruct the court in performance of his judicial duties.
Another writ, and I haven't had time to figure this one out. Did he spend more time in prison than Rutherford did?
No, much short.
I didn't calculate the time because that would have been funny.
It's just interesting. So Hudgens went to prison. So here we have on file the Atlanta Penitentiary release records for the Watchtower bunch because they had to travel back to go to New York to testify for the Hudgens trial. The judge's dissent here, and it's the judge that was corrupted later, so I put his picture down there. There's 3 judges that rule on this. 2 voted for Watchtower, and then the 1 voted against. But his dissent is very interesting. The 4 counts for which the Watchtower bunch went to prison, the finished mystery wasn't the reason. The 4 counts listed were: first count, a conspiracy to cause insubordination, etc., in the military and naval forces of the United States. Second count, a conspiracy to obstruct the recruiting and enlistment service of the United States. Third count, an attempt to cause insubordination, etc., in the military and naval forces of the United States. Fourth count, obstructing the recruiting and enlistment service of the United States, etc. And in the dissent, Judge Manton says, the offenses charged were committed between June 16, 1917 and May 6, 1918. The corporations, acting through their officers and employees who were indicted between June 30th, 1917 and March 1918, caused to be published 850,000 copies of a book called The Finished Mystery. These copies were distributed in large numbers in the army camps of the United States, and many hundreds of thousands of copies were distributed throughout the United States and Canada. And then some of the examples that he gives are interesting. One duchess, formerly a National Guardsman, sold a copy of the book to one citizen of Binghamton, New York. The latter claimed exemption later before the local board as a conscientious objector and was aided in this by the defendant Van Amper. When Innsbruck was drafted and sent to Camp Devens in October 1917. After purchasing the book, he refused to perform any military duty. He later bought a dozen volumes of the book and put them in the library of the Young Men's Christian Association at Camp Devens. Later he deserted. One Dekeka was drafted, sent to Camp Devens, took a copy of the book with him, and then refused to work in camp. When Nisiti was drafted, sent to Camp Devens, got 30 copies of the book, distributed them in camp. After he put on his uniform, he took it off and refused to do any work in the camp. One Anderson was drafted and sent to Camp Upton. After reading the book, he deserted, came to the Tabernacle, the defendant's establishment, and while there, an army officer was looking for him. He saw the officer use the fire escape as a means of escaping the building. The record is replete with evidence indicating the defendants active advising men subject to the draft to claim their exemption and to refuse to perform any duty. The Finnish mystery wasn't the reason, but it was a part of the evidence because they were sending the Finnish mystery to the army camps with these letters and comments about avoiding military service. So that's part of their problem.
So he specifically stated the Finnish mystery was not the reason why we, the government, were coming against you.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yes.
Okay, we've got that. And it was just part of evidence is part of the case. Yeah. Supplemental evidence.
Yeah.
Here's the documentation. This is the truth.
So it's interesting. How did the Bible students understand this at the time? So here's a letter that was sent to the Watchtower bunch when they were in prison. And they don't say, oh, you were brought up on trumped up charges and blah, blah, blah. It's interesting because it says, of course we know we all make mistakes. They recognize that.
This I've never seen.
Of course we know we all make mistakes, and we are so thankful for the precious blood of Jesus Christ, which cleanses us from all sin. There's nothing here about an unjust imprisonment.
Now, with that said, if they thought they were blameless, they would have worded it differently.
Yeah.
That seems to me like, hey, don't take it so hard. You made a mistake. We'll get back on our feet when this is all done. You don't just make a statement like, we all make mistakes.
Yeah.
That's when you know somebody did something wrong. Yeah. Like if your friend's son got arrested for breaking a window. We all make mistakes. We can move on for this. So this is probably one of the most critical evidences in the case.
It's quite interesting. Again, this is the narrative at the time.
And it's documented, sent to the prison.
It's documented.
So we're not pulling this stuff up out of thin air or making it up or unknown sources. This is coming from the government. But
again, Watchtower was still trying to spin this narrative about the clergy doing all of this, and it was an unjust thing. So if we look at the St. Paul Enterprise, April 1st, 1919 issue, it says 8 Bible students released on bail. New trials granted. In this article, in this editorial, they're trying to spin this story again that the clergy should be blamed, and they're trying to grow out this entire narrative. And the editorial points out that this newspaper called Appeal to Reason devoted an entire issue to the matter. So here's the Appeal to Reason. I was able to find all 4 pages of this, and it doesn't say much than what we've already found, right? This paper was actually a very famous socialist newspaper of the time.
So now the KKK, socialists, where does it end? Bootlegging, mansions, Broadway risque plays. I mean, it just goes on and on.
And if you've seen our discussion on Beth Sarim, and we look at the evidence about what Rutherford claims happened to him in prison, and he says, I was sick and I was in prison and I had pneumonia and I lost a lung. When we look at the documented evidence, it doesn't look like he was that sick until months after. It appears that he was probably healthy when he was in prison.
In good health.
Yeah. So it's when he come out of prison during the influenza outbreak that he gets sick. So Months later, yeah. The Proclaimer's book says very specifically, Brother Rutherford had a severe case of pneumonia after his release from unjust imprisonment in 1919. So if I say that phrase, what do you understand by that? What is the Proclaimer's book saying or claiming?
That he got pneumonia due to prison.
Okay.
And weren't there watchtowers that made that claim also?
They were later on, but this is a first-hand account written at the time. So in the May 27th, 1919 St. Paul Enterprise, it says that Rutherford was on the convention program. However, it says Brother Rutherford has been quite sick with pneumonia, but is rapidly recovering and will be present. He was very, very sick, exactly as Proclaimer's book says, but there's something not right here. This is May 27th. When was Rutherford and his friends released from prison?
Well, weren't they released in March for this? So March, April, May, that's 2 months.
Over 2 months, yeah.
So he had pneumonia for 2 months?
I don't think he got pneumonia when he was in prison. We won't deal with the unjust imprisonment part here, because that's another discussion for a future time. The statement is specifically about Rutherford's sickness. So that's what we're going to take a look at and see what documented evidence we have about that period of time. The March 27th, 1919 National Labor Tribune has a letter that J.F. Rutherford wrote from the Long Island jail before he was sent to the Atlanta penitentiary. It also has an interesting letter that was written by the wife of George Fisher, the man who dared disfellowship Rutherford, about their prison experience during the Christmas of 1918. And it talks about all the Christmas gifts that they received. More than 150 prisoners in the castle had nothing for Christmas. Our brethren got a list of them from the officers and, out of their own abundance, made up a little Christmas package for each of the unfortunates. And by this many were made happy. Even the officers were so pleased that they were heard to say, "Never was anything like that done at this place before." And so we can truly say that the Lord was in the prison that Christmas. I knew each of you would be glad to know these things because each of you had a part in them. But it says something very specific that helps illustrate the point about whether or not Rutherford was sick while in prison. In the second paragraph of the letter, she says, "Many of their presents were packages of good, substantial, and wholesome food. Since receiving it, they have much improved physically. The oranges and grapefruit have been specially beneficial and probably have saved them from much sickness and suffering. The other foods have built them up physically, and each one is feeling much better. They're very grateful to the Lord for these temporal blessings and are very desirous of expressing their thankfulness and gratitude to the dear ones sending the gifts." Remember, this is during the 1918 influenza outbreak. We've done a couple discussions also about the Watchtower celebrations of birthdays and Christmas in 1918 and 19. And so if you haven't seen those, please go take a look. You'll find some of the historical information there quite interesting. I find it interesting and a little ironic that the organization that dumped Christmas later is saved by the Christmas gifts, and it's also what kept them healthy while they were in prison. Very interesting. We have a couple telegrams from the National Labor Tribune that seems to suggest that they were in good health when they left prison. And we know from the Watchtower that they had a dinner for them, and there's no mention of Rutherford being sick until we get to this issue of the Enterprise at the end of it.
Even though the proclaimers said it was at that time.
It's written very strangely. It says, Brother Rutherford had a severe case of pneumonia after his release from unjust imprisonment in 1919. Why are you even mentioning the unjust imprisonment if it has nothing to do with the pneumonia? Right? They seem like they're almost tying it together.
They're trying to tie it in.
Right. We have multiple lines of evidence, including from the wife of the man who dared disfellowship Rutherford, Harriet Fisher, that illustrates that the men were relatively healthy even at Christmas time of 1918. They were healthy in March of 1919 when they were released. We don't hear anything about any sickness of Rutherford until later. So they have to bring out the point that he was put in prison and it was unjust, but they're tying in the pneumonia to it, and it really has no relation at all. So it's
based on the time frame of about 2 months. It could have just said he was recovering from pneumonia, period, and left it at that.
Right, but we know from this article he's sick a full 2 months after. Right. And these telegrams from the National Labor Tribune says, "May it have been with God's providence to keep you all in the best of health." So when they were released from prison, they were in good health.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't until the end of May that Rutherford's sick. So point number one in the article, I say there's something suspicious, or it's suspicious how it's written. His sickness has nothing to do with his imprisonment, for sure.
Based on the documentation here, that seems like a solved issue.
Yeah, it's suspiciously written. So it's point number one has an issue. Even better. So in this June 3rd, 1919 Enterprise, there's a letter about that May convention that Rutherford spoke at. Even though Rutherford was suffering from pneumonia, as the Enterprise says, the convention that he went to, he gave a lecture for over 2 hours. This is during the 1918 pandemic, and I don't think anyone was wearing masks. So if he's that sick, he's infecting everyone around him. It's a super spreader event, right? So how sick was he? Or he was pretty sick and he pushed himself too far. We do know that he ended up with the use of just one lung because of the pneumonia that he had. It did damage he did get very, very ill, and it did some damage, internal damage. They should have been doing their social distancing, I guess. So check out our Bessarim discussion on that. Very, very interesting.
Upon their release, the men were consumed with zeal. Within 6 months, headquarters was moved back to Brooklyn, and arrangements were made for a convention at Cedar Point, Ohio. It was here that they launched a companion magazine to the Watchtower called The Golden Age. Its purpose? To explain the meaning of world events and to inspire hope in the supreme remedy.
Rutherford and his associates had only just been released from prison. And then within a couple of months, they organized this tremendous convention and announced the release of a new magazine, The Golden Age. Now, that's something that really is unbelievable. You go from one situation where there's hardly anything happening. The next thing, it's just full speed ahead.
It's interesting if you think about the timing of this, because right after Russell died, when Watchtower was broke, the first thing they did to generate some financial inflow, some financial income, was to publish the finished mystery. As soon as they're released from prison, they're in a financial bind yet again. And what do? They find another supplemental cash inflow by starting another magazine. The timing is just very, very interesting, if you think about it.
On September 8th, 1922, another convention was held at Cedar Point. Here, Rutherford gave what would become perhaps his most memorable speech.
Do you believe that the King of Glory has begun his reign? Yes! Then back to the field. The world must know that Jehovah is God and that Jesus Christ is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. This is the day of all days. Behold, the King reigns. You are his publicity agents. Therefore, advertise, advertise, advertise the King and his kingdom.
And advertise they did.
And we've discussed all this before. This advertise, and these Cedar Point conventions. This prison experience became the main focal point of nearly the entirety of Watchtower doctrine. Creature worship to the extreme. Rutherford saying, it's all about me. We've discussed this as well in our first trumpet blast discussion. And we've also discussed it in our second trumpet blast discussion. Judge Rutherford judges sheep and goats. So, the charge here was stated that everyone must preach. But if you think about the scripture says not all are teachers, it says some are teachers. 1 Corinthians 12. Some are prophets, some are evangelizers, not all. God places each of us in the body differently. We each have different gifts of the Spirit. So why to try and mold and shape everyone to be exactly alike and have the same kind of
When you're
gift? It's different.
selling a book
Yeah,
and everybody does it versus the evangelizers only or the preachers only, it eats into your profit. And I'm not trying to be funny
right.
with this, but people don't understand. They raised a lot of money placing books. We won't even say selling it. All the money went. They had free distributors. Nobody charged the society to go out and place the books. They collected the money, gave it to the society. Were the prices of the books well below what a commercial average? Of course it was. But you also had volunteer labor, both printing and
Yeah,
distributing. So that automatically allowed the cost to be cut. Did they make a profit on those books? Absolutely.
absolutely. Yeah.
You couldn't have built Brooklyn, New York, Beth Serene, and all these places without a lot of profits, especially during the Depression.
And then Rutherford died. How was news of Brother Rutherford's death received at Bethel? I will never forget the day we learned of Brother Rutherford's passing, recalled William A. Elrod, who had been a member of the Bethel family for 9 years. It was at noontime when the family was assembled for lunch. The announcement was brief. There were no speeches. No one took the day off to mourn. Rather, we went back to the factory and worked harder than ever. And as important as Rutherford was to the organization, President Knorr barely gave any notice to his death. They mentioned it at breakfast, and they simply went about their business with no time to mourn. Went back to the printing presses, went back to everything, didn't talk about it.
Well, it's in that instance, it's almost as if he was already dead, because by then, as our documentation has shown, he was doing some serious drinking in the mansion. He was there by himself doing his thing, and it was like they probably were giving him reports. Oh, we're doing this, and letting him think he's in charge. They probably already took it over at that point.
Well, I was just talking to Barbara Anderson a week ago, and she said that when she was investigating some of these things, and that she found in a drawer some compromising photos of Rutherford. So, completely inebriated. One of them was him sticking out his tongue. Another one, he's in those old one-piece bathing suits with his big belly sticking out. And you could tell by the way his eyes look, he's completely drunk. She didn't make copies of them. She just handed it, because that time she was fully in, right? So she kind of handed them over to the archival department and went about their business. But, there's documented evidence out there that someday, unless they burnt it, someday maybe it'll come to light.
Yeah.
But
anyway,
there's
been plenty of documentation about his drinking from ex-Bible students and many, many people. It's not just one person saying it. It's been a lot of people making those statements over the years.
Ex-Bible students, because he slandered them in print.
In court,
and they took him to court.
Yeah.
So it's in the court transcript, legal transcript, the Moyle and the Salter trial. So a future discussion for another time. But, this is just our part one discussion of the first film. And at some point in the future, we'll do a discussion on the second film. But we want to back up and discuss some of these other details of history before we get there. So the second film will be another discussion for another time, but this has been another very interesting discussion. You know what to do. To click like and subscribe. Be sure to comment, like the comments, so you can help push the videos up to the YouTube algorithms. Help us out. Advertise for us. Thanks, Paul. This has been a great discussion.
Thank
again.
you. This was very revealing.
Take care. Keep reading, everyone. Thank you again, Paul. This has been a very fascinating discussion. Thank you all for watching. Like and subscribe. Leave some comments. Let us know what you'd like to see in the future. Get a whole story, not just from the Watchtower's perspective, but from all the various splinter groups. What were they saying? So until next time, keep reading.